All right, so once again, welcome everybody to Mushrooms with our own Dr. Ellen Crocker, one of our state coordinators for the Master Naturalist program, but also lots of other things. And of course, as you might have guessed, today we are going to be focusing on mushrooms of Kentucky, with a little bit of a choose your own adventure twist to it. So if you're here for the live webinar, then you'll kind of have the opportunity to give some input on what you'd like to talk about later on. And if you're watching the recorded webinar version, then, hopefully you have a good time learning as well. If you have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom, or you can also drop them in the chat. And then if you're watching on the pre-recorded version or the playback later on down the road, our recorded version, and you have any questions on anything that we cover today, just feel free to reach out to, one of us, to myself or Ellen or Lori or whoever email is most readily accessible to you. And we would be happy to either answer that question, or if it's me, I can direct you to get in touch with Ellen, and she can answer those questions for you. So having said all that, I don't want to take too long. If we'd like to go ahead and get started, I am definitely ready to learn about mushrooms if you're ready to talk about them, Dr. Crocker.
Yes, I'm always ready to talk about mushrooms, So thanks for having me on today. It's been a great summer webinar series. So, big shout out to Anna for coordinating that. Appreciate what you've been doing behind the scenes, Anna, to bring us these great speakers.
It just means that I get to sit here and learn about all kinds of things. I feel way smarter than I did a month and a half ago.
I felt the same way.
Yeah.
We're learning about lichens, reptiles, and amphibians, and of course, the very, very cool forests of Western Kentucky and wetlands. So thanks to our speakers for those. But today we're going to talk about mushrooms and all things mushrooms and fungi. I think we could start out with, what are we talking about when we talk about mushrooms? I'm sure if you're on today, it's because you know about mushrooms, you're interested in learning more. But for most folks, when they think about mushrooms, what they're thinking about are what you can get in the grocery store, button mushrooms. And really, most of the mushrooms that you'd find there would all be the same species: portobellas, cremini, button mushrooms, all the same species, all grown indoors in large operations. But they're kind of like just the very tip of the diversity of mushrooms that are out there, and the great diversity of fungi that you might find as a master naturalist when you're out and about in the woods or other places. So when we talk about mushrooms, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the fruiting bodies of a fungus. They are what is making spores, which are the way that fungi reproduce sexually. So the mushrooms are the structures that these bigger fungal bodies produce to reproduce, to spread to new areas. And just a quick note that not all fungi make mushrooms. In fact, most fungi do not. Mushrooms are kind of, the rarer way that mushrooms would do this. Now, most mushrooms do reproduce, of course, and spread to new places with spores, but those might be microscopic, tiny little mushrooms that you would never normally see. Things like, if you've left something too long in your fridge and it gets moldy and covered with something that's green and powdery, those are mushrooms reproducing and producing spores, just really tiny ones. Versus when you think of mushrooms, you're going to be thinking of macroscopic fruiting bodies that are produced by these fungi, and on them they have specialized structures that make spores, which is how those fungi are going to travel to new locations and make new fungi. So as we're talking about mushrooms, when you think of a mushroom and a fungus and how it works, it's totally different from plants, but I'm going to use this analogy of a tree, in that we know we've got this tree But we also know that we've got roots below ground. We know that we have the fruits, in this case, the apples, but inside of those apples, we have the seeds of that tree. So fungi spend most of their life underground or below something, inside of something growing. And that body is called the mycelium, the main part of that fungus. Most of the time, we're not going to see it, even more so than the roots of a tree. This is going to be something we are typically not going to see, these fine filamentous threads that are growing. They're exuding chemicals that will break down the substance that they're growing in. They're digesting that substance that they're eating. And, that's what they're doing, whether it's wood or soil or whatever else they might be growing in. And then when they produce the mushrooms, that's going to be like the fruit. And then those mushrooms have spores on them, which are going to be kind of like the seeds. So while fungi are totally different from plants, we're probably more closely related to fungi than they are to plants, believe it or not. That's a comparison of how their lives work and why are they producing these mushrooms that we care about. So here's a picture of a video of some puffballs that I'm poking, and you can see that powdery stuff that they're emitting. That's the spores. So while these look very different from most mushrooms you'd think of, they are fruiting bodies of that fungus whose whole purpose is to get those spores out to make more little fungi. And here's another picture of what that mycelium might look like. In this case, growing through the leaf litter and the soil, breaking down that plant tissue and then feeding on that. So an important note, fungi are not photosynthetic. Plants can photosynthesize, get energy from the sun. Fungi can't do that. They're kind of like us. They need to eat. And different fungi eat different things, but for the most part, a lot of them are going to be eating plant material, breaking that down into more digestible forms. So a very important role that those fungi are playing, which gets us into when we see mushrooms in nature, what are they doing? So the number one thing that they're doing is exactly what these mushrooms and the fungi that are producing them, because we see the mushrooms, we're seeing these fruiting bodies that are forming on this log. But what we don't see is that running through the wood in this log is fungi, those tiny filamentous threads that we saw in some of those earlier pictures. What are they doing there? This is what I think of the number one role that they're playing in nature. They are recyclers. They are nature's recyclers. They are breaking down cellulose and hemicellulose and lignin, which are really tough things to break down. Not a lot of organisms can do that. And recycling those nutrients so they're accessible once again. So the number one thing, if you see a fungus, a mushroom, probably the fungus that's producing it is recycling dead tissue. So in the case of these really cool maze-like polypores here with these maze-like structures on the underside, breaking down the wood in that log. Now you can also see the same kind of type of thing happening in grass. Maybe it's breaking down some of the dead roots and tissue that's in your lawn. You'll definitely see this happening in mulch, breaking down the wood in the mulch, all this white fluffy stuff in here. I'm sure if you have a garden and you've had mulch, you've seen all these white little hairs running through your mulch and wondered, oh, do I need to be worried about this? Is this going to hurt my plants? Well, probably what it's doing is it's feeding on that wood, breaking it down and making it accessible, building the soil in your garden. So it's actually probably a good thing for your plants. Here's another common recycler that we have, an oyster mushroom. And you can see what it's doing is it's breaking down the wood in this dead branch. Now, there's a pretty fine line in wood between what's living and what's dead, because it's all cellulose and other kind of related structures there. So in addition to just recycling dead tissue, you can also get mushrooms and the fungi that produce them that are pathogens. They are causing disease. And the difference between those can sometimes be be kind of fine. But I would look at it as something that's going to be attacking the living tissue as well as the dead. Now, if you've got a big tree, and those fungi get into the heartwood of that tree, that's pretty physiologically dead. So you can get occasions where you could have a big wound on the side of the tree, and you can have a fungus that's gotten in there and it's colonizing and it's eating. And from its perspective, if the tree is alive or it's dead, whatever, it's just degrading that wood, acting as a wood decay fungus. And it can cause structural damage to trees. But you can also get things like this particular fungus that is feeding on the roots of the tree. And I don't know if you can see in this picture, but you can kind of see a cluster here, a cluster there, a cluster closer to the tree following that root. So it's going to be decaying the roots of that tree and feeding on that wood, causing decline of that tree over time. You can get lots of different fungi that are going to act as pathogens in this way. When we find them in nature, a lot of those are going to be on trees, of course, because we've got a lot of trees here. From this one, which is oak bracket fungus, you can see a lot of it this time of year at the base of oak trees, to this one, which is really common on black locust, causing little pockets of decay in black locust, especially kind of coming in on a wound, causing a pocket of decay, maybe increasing the chance that that tree is going to snap or break. But you can also find fungi being pathogens of all sorts of things. You might see them in your yard, causing problems in your yard. We're not going to talk about any of these fungi, but other fungi can be pathogens of animals, even of humans. But to my knowledge, none of them produce mushrooms. Those are going to be different types of fungi. So the ones that are producing mushrooms, I commonly see them as pathogens of trees or other plants, woody plants. So we mentioned fungi being recyclers, fungi being pathogens, but of course they can also play really positive roles in the environment with the organisms that they kind of interact with. And not to say that it's not a positive role for them to be recycling things, that's very important. And even as pathogens, fungi are an important part of how we get diversity in our natural plant systems. You're not going to get the same plant over and over again if you've got these pathogens that kind of keep things in check. Maybe when one thing gets too common, it will cause disease on that and knock it back a little bit. So even something like that, while you might not like it on the tree in your yard, can have positive impacts in natural communities. But fungi can also act as mutualists, so being in beneficial relationships with other organisms. And some of the mushrooms that you might find growing in the woods might be mutualists, growing with the roots of trees. The tree photosynthesizes and gets sugars that way. The fungus doesn't photosynthesize, so it needs to find its food, but it can have better access to water and nutrients in the soil. Think about those fine hyphae that we saw, those fine little threads of fungi. That's going to really give them better access than many of the plant roots would have by themselves. So they can form this partnership. And some of the mushrooms that you might find would be doing exactly this kind of thing. A lot of them in our woods. Our woods have a lot of mycorrhizal fungi. We have lots of different species of trees, and many of those trees are going to have their own specialized relationships with different mycorrhizal fungi, as well as mycorrhizal fungi that are maybe less species specific. I also wanted to mention, in addition to things like mushrooms that enter into these mutualistic relationships, you can get some below ground fruiting bodies like the truffle shown here. Maybe doesn't look anything like a mushroom that you would think of, but is the fruiting body of that fungus, and it's growing below ground, in this case, mutualistically as a mycorrhizal fungus with the roots of trees. And if you're lucky, producing a delicious truffle that you might be able to find and enjoy. So just a little bit of background on, some of these mushrooms, what are they and what are they doing in nature when we find them? Next, I'm going to share with you all a quick poll because I would like to know what would you like to learn more about? So for the rest of today's presentation, there's so much to talk about with mushrooms. We could spend all day talking about mushrooms, but we don't have all day. We only have like 40 more minutes together. So I wanted to check with you all, what would you like to learn about? So you should see a poll pop up right now. Those of you who are joining live, would you like to learn about your common mushrooms that you're going to see all the time in your yard, in your landscape? Would you like to learn a little bit more about mushroom foraging basics? I know that's a really common question that I receive. Or would you like to learn more about growing mushrooms? So I'm happy to chat about any of those with you all today. Make sure to vote about what you most want to hear about, and we'll try to discuss that. So you have another couple minutes. In the meantime, do you have any questions that you'd like to put in the chat or in the Q&A? All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions, but I think we have a clear winner from our poll. So everyone has participated. Thank you. And our top one is foraging mushrooms. So it looks like folks were interested in learning about common mushrooms and foraging mushrooms the most. So I think we're going to jump into mushroom foraging basics, but don't worry, we're going to cover some of the common foraged mushrooms in the state as well. So when we're thinking about mushroom foraging, how many of you, if you want, put it in the chat, already forage mushrooms, and what types of mushrooms are you out there hunting for? You can share that and let us know if so. But it's a challenging thing to get into in some ways if you didn't grow up doing it, because mushrooms are really hard to identify. That is unfortunately the truth. There are so many species of mushrooms, so many species of fungi. This is a table with just one afternoon's collecting from me at a mushroom foraging foray, where people go and they collect mushrooms and then they just try to identify them, try to figure out what they found. It's estimated that there are over 5 million species of fungi, of which we only know a small percentage of those, because most of the time they are underground, they are doing things away from us, and we only see these ephemeral mushrooms for a really brief window of time. The foray that I go to most often is in North Carolina, and in the fall, people will go out and spend a weekend seeing what mushrooms they can find, what's the diversity that's there. So in a given weekend, they might find a few hundred species of mushrooms, which is enough by itself. But over the many years that this foray has been happening, they've found thousands of different species. So I give that as an example because you're really getting this kind of little window onto the total diversity of fungi that might be there. And it's really hard to know all of what's out there. And on top of that, some species are deadly. This is one of our deadly Amanita species, Amanita bisporidura, that even a few bites of it can kill you or require an organ transplant if you've eaten it. It looks so innocent. This beautiful looking white, mushroom does not look like it would kill you, but this has been a cause of many deaths in the United States, particularly when people are coming from some other part of the world where this might look like a mushroom that was totally safe to eat. Here it is not. So some mushrooms are deadly poisonous and you don't want to mix them up. Others are delicious and great finds. I saw in the chat that a lot of folks like hunting these morels, dry land fish, hickory chickens. There's lots of great names for our morels, which tend to pop up in the spring. Those are one of the most commonly foraged species in the state. Chanterelles, chicken of the woods, and others that are great finds. But unfortunately, there's no simple test to determine what a mushroom species is, unless you really like sequencing DNA and have a whole home lab setup. Many of these species can be tricky, and there's also no simple test for what's safe to eat and not. It's really about learning mushrooms and learning what's safe to eat and what's not. There's no kind of quick and easy assay that you can do to say this is safe to eat, this is not safe to eat. So today I'll talk a little bit about some beginner mushroom foraging tips. I'll give you 7 tips for beginner mushroom foragers. Now I know that if you're watching us today, you might be an expert at mushroom foraging, and this is not for you, but hopefully it will be some good information to for anybody who's new to thinking about this, to get you started in the right direction and gives you some confidence for how to proceed ahead. Those 7 tips, and we're going to go through each one of them in a little bit more detail, are: always identify mushrooms to species. Instead of just looking at it and thinking, does this look good to eat or not? Know what species it is, and then only forage those species that you know are easy to identify and that you can confidently identify. You can distinguish them from anything else and be completely confident in your identification. That's something that I think a lot of folks, when they start out, there's such an amazing diversity of mushrooms out there, and you can mushroom hunt for fun and for identification. It's this really kind of interesting game or hunt that you can have in the woods, trying to figure out what is this mushroom. But when it comes to foraging and eating mushrooms, instead of picking something and thinking, can I eat it? Know what's out there that you can safely eat and only try to eat those things. And you can add to that kind of a list of what you feel confident with over time. But it's a lot easier to be confident that you have a morel than to be confident of exactly what everything is. So hopefully sharing a little bit more information about how to get started with that. Another thing I really highly recommend is to hunt with knowledgeable people. There is no webinar that I'm going to do or anything you can read on the internet that is going to replace knowledgeable local mushroom foragers. These aren't necessarily people who are going to have formal training in this, but people who are knowledgeable about the land that you're in, your area, and have experience doing that. In the mushroom kind of enthusiast community, there's a lot of expertise present in other community members who want to teach people about it and share their passion. So we'll talk a little bit about ways to connect with groups for that. Fifth, because we are in a time when you can post pictures online to various social media groups or others to try to get identification, how do you take photos of mushrooms that enable that ID versus aren't going to help you out? Sixth, if you're foraging mushrooms, if you're eating them, always store them properly and save a few in case you get sick. Because what they have found is that the most common way people become sick from eating mushrooms is actually eating mushrooms that are edible, like grocery store mushrooms that maybe have been contaminated with bacteria or weren't processed or stored properly. So making sure that you're following all those proper safety precautions there, and then saving a few in case, hopefully not, but you do start to feel ill, you can share those with an expert to confirm what it was that you ate and could that be responsible for you feeling sick. And then 7th, only mushroom hunt where you're allowed. There are places in the state of Kentucky that allow mushroom hunting and places that don't. If you're mushroom hunting on your own land, that's a totally different situation and you can do whatever you'd like. But if you're mushroom hunting on public lands, you want to be aware of some of those rules and regulations. So just a point that this is a starting point to those who are new to thinking about mushroom foraging. Today's presentation, we've got half an hour together left. It's not going to be a qualification to start foraging or substitute from any other training, but hopefully is a good starting point. So we're going to our 7 mushroom foraging tips. I'm going to talk a little bit more about each one of them. First, always identify mushrooms to species. So this is one that I think, because of the incredible diversity of mushrooms that are out there, you have your work cut out for you to identify something to species, and you want to be confident that it doesn't just look like this picture you saw this one time of what that mushroom should look like. You know what the different structures are that tell you, is it a morel, is it a chanterelle, or is it not? So I'm going to walk through some basic mushroom identification features that I look for mushroom ID, period. That could be for foraging, but for any mushroom identification. A lot of times when I'm out looking at mushrooms, I just want to learn about the diversity of what's there. I'm not interested in eating them. I just want to learn more. And these are all of the parts of the mushroom that I'm looking at and I'm thinking about that are really easy to miss unless you know that they're there and you should be looking at them. So if I think about a mushroom, what are the key parts of it? First, we've got this cap, which is probably the part you're most familiar with. It's what you're going to be purchasing when you buy mushrooms at the grocery store to eat, for the most part. But underneath that cap is where some of the most important structures are for mushroom ID. Some mushrooms have gills, some will have other structures on the underside of the cap. And knowing that can tell you a lot about what type of a mushroom it is. But then they also many times, and this varies because some fungal fruiting bodies are going to look radically different. I showed you a puffball earlier, right? It doesn't have any of these structures. But for kind of your typical mushroom, the cap, whatever structure, gills or otherwise, are under the cap, the stem, and that stem can have lots of different things around it. It could have this ring around the stem. That's an artifact of when that mushroom was opening up. It probably had a little membrane here that connected to the edge of the cap, and that was pulled apart as it was opening up. But that will take you to certain groups of mushrooms. It doesn't tell you what species that is, but it can cue you in on some different groups, because some groups do that and some groups don't. Similarly, some groups have gills, some groups have pores, some groups have teeth. It's not going to tell you exactly what it is, but it's going to be a key component of any identification. And then looking at the base, some mushrooms and groups of mushrooms have interesting structures around the base that can be very important to ID, and also really easy to miss if they're growing in the forest floor, under some leaf litter, under some soil. You can easily miss seeing those structures if you don't know to look for them or that they're there. So let's look at the cap a little bit more. I just want to give you a little bit of exposure to the great world of cap shapes and sizes and structures that are out there. So this is just a part of a book that I have that goes through cap shape and different types of cap shape. So mushroom caps can vary from being these little bell-like structures, very tiny and delicate, to something like this mushroom right here, which is all kind of refracted out and flat, to these black trumpets that have a trumpet shape to them, to this shaggy mane right here that has this almost bell-like structure that over time is going to melt from this edge down until the whole thing is a mess. And they come in lots of different cap shapes, and sometimes people will focus on the top of that cap. What's going on with that cap? What's its color? And what's the color of the cap? That is surprisingly unhelpful for mushroom identification, because very different mushrooms can have very similar colors. Similarly, the shape, while it can be helpful, like this black trumpet, you're not going to mix it up for this one. These are going to be totally different. Some mushrooms are going to start out more in this bell-like shape, and then as they get older, and it's just a few days, mushrooms many of these are going to be pretty ephemeral. They're going to come and go. They're going to expand out, and they're going to change their shape over time. That's important to know and is useful information for you as you're trying to figure out what this is, that it might look different as it matures. It also might look different based on the weather conditions. Sometimes if it was really wet right when they were coming out and then it dried up, you might get more cracking on the cap. Whereas that's something that some mushrooms just do a lot. But I'd encourage you to pretty much immediately go from looking at the top of the cap to looking at the underside of the cap. What's going on with the underside of the cap? In this case, we've got some gills. So you see these kind of blade-like structures on the underside of the cap. That's a very common way that mushrooms produce spores. What you can't see, because it's microscopic, we'd have to look under the microscope and get pretty lucky, is that on the surface of each one of these little gills are these tiny little structures called basidia that make little basidia spores that are how that mushroom is spreading. Those spores that we saw spreading to new places. So those are going to be arranged on those gills. But mushrooms are very diverse and they have evolved in many different ways to do the same exact thing. So when we see mushrooms with pores and we see mushrooms with teeth, they're also trying to get spores out. It's just a different way of doing it. But in addition to looking for, what's underneath the cap, how is it arranged? So in this case, what I'm illustrating is it's not enough to just know that they have gills. Do you see how these gills stop short of the stem? And these run down the stem. It might look like nothing, but this is a useful kind of difference that would be beneficial in identification. These are called decurrent. They're running down the stem for some length. Again, it doesn't tell you exactly which group or what species, but some do this and some don't. And these are called free. They're not attached to the stem. Some do this and some don't. And so that's another really useful thing to look for. There's lots of other things about the cap and what's going on with the cap that could be useful, but what's under the cap is the one that I think a lot of beginning mushroom identifiers miss, but it's very important. So they could look identical from the top, and look radically different from the underside. So from the top, both of these mushrooms look the same shade of orange. But if I flip them over, what I found is that this one has gills right here, and this one totally different. What's going on with that? It looks like a sponge, a kitchen sponge underneath there. It's pores. So instead of having the spores arranged on the sides of this gill, again, they're going to be microscopic and we can't see them. This one is going to produce them inside these pores. So a different structure, but to the same goal, very important for identification. If you can't determine whether something has gills or pores, you're kind of stuck in an ID perspective. So just to give you some illustrations of the wide world of different things underneath the cap of mushrooms, this particular species, this Lactarius, has these beautiful blue gills right here, crowded in there really tight. They go right to the edge of the stem, but they don't run down it. This one, those of you who said you hunt chanterelles may see a familiar mushroom right here. This is our smooth chanterelle, one of the many chanterelle species that we have, but all of the chanterelles kind of look like they have gills, but if you look at these, they actually look pretty different. And these almost look like they've been melted. You would not be able to easily remove these from that mushroom, whereas these you could peel off pretty easily. These would not. And chanterelles don't actually have gills. They have raised ridges that can look like gills. The smooth chanterelles have especially melted looking raised ridges. So it's why it looks so smooth there. A different structure, and these are teeth. This is a northern tooth fungus, has little teeth that the spores are going to be produced on, and this one has pores. Not to say all, I'm just talking mushroom identification in general. You can run into all sorts of different things under the cap. Another thing that a lot of folks miss and don't look for the first time, but is crucial for identification to species, would be spore color. This is not gill color and not spore color, but the color of those spores that the mushroom is producing. Some mushrooms will produce chocolatey brown spores, others black spores, others cream color spores or green spores or pink spores, all sorts of different colored spores. And if you want to have some fun, look at them under a compound microscope and you'll find that they all have different, some of them are ornamented with like really interesting shapes and structures on the outside as well that could be useful if you are really going deep into mushroom identification. But there are, for a few species that you might want to forage, key differences. You don't want to mix up some of these. And taking a spore print can be a really useful way to confirm what you think you have. So this is a portobello mushroom that I did a spore print with on white paper, and you can see it has this deep chocolatey brown colored spores. So basically put it so that the gills are face down on that sheet of paper. You can see I covered it with a bowl or something to kind of keep it moist in there, keep it from drying out. Wait a few hours or maybe overnight and come back and see what color spores you have. You can see this one was done on black paper and it has this kind of creamy white colored spore. You can use paper that's both colors so you can kind of see no matter what, or maybe aluminum foil so you can see no matter what was there. That can be very, very useful in identification, but requires more work and time. Is not something you're going to be able to do in the field as you're looking at the mushroom, unless you happen to get really lucky and it's left that spore print underneath. Also, not all mushrooms are going to produce ready, like easy to access spore prints for you. So it really varies. Some are going to be better than others. Something like morels and chanterelles, this would not be something you could do as easily, or many of our polypores, but a really useful tool for anybody who's trying to get into mushroom identification. Oh, and a clarification, when I mentioned aluminum foil, because it has that silvery color, if you put it underneath, you can kind of see those spores no matter what color they are. Versus if you put this on white paper and the spores are white, you're not going to see them. Or if they're on black paper and the spores are black, you're not going to see them as well. Anything that will allow you to kind of get a better glimpse of what that might be. Hopefully that clarified. Other things to look for that I look for and can vary a lot in mushrooms, things like the stem. What's its shape? Texture, size, is it hollow? In the case of these morels, anybody who's a morel hunter knows you're looking for a hollow stem, and it looks like a rubber, the inside of a rubber mold or something like that. It's not going to be filled with fibers or solid. That would be something else, and you'd want to know that if you're hunting for morels. Other things, that ring that we mentioned before, some mushrooms have these rings, including some that you might forage and eat. Some mushrooms have these rings, including some that could be deadly poisonous. So not saying that the ring is, edible, not edible, but it's an important tool for identification. Another feature that's super easy to miss would be around the base. So right around the base of some mushrooms, you might get weird structures. You might get swellings, like on this one. You might get that mushroom hatching out of an egg-like structure. And it's not an egg, they're fungi, they're their own separate thing, but it's like it's hatching out of this little egg and leaves behind a little membrane there. But you could easily miss that if it's under the leaf litter. While several different groups of mushrooms do this, all of the ones in the picture here are from the genus Amanita. That also includes the one I showed you earlier, the deadly poisonous mushroom that will kill you potentially with just a few bites. That's in this group, but so are some that people might eat. I would not advise those as beginning mushrooms for foragers. Just they're in the same genus, but some are deadly and some are not. So it's very important to know what are the different features that help you identify those species. So some other things that you might look for that are less apparent from a photo or reading about it in a book. Things like smell. Some mushrooms, especially once you've been foraging for a while, might have a distinctive smell. I know folks who forage chanterelles might say that they would smell like apricots. I don't know about that. I've foraged a lot of chanterelles, and while they do have a fresh smell, I can't quite place it. Whereas something, this is not one would forage, but it does have a very distinctive smell. This is a stinkhorn. They're super common in mulch beds, and as well as in kind of forest and natural areas. But the smell is disgusting. The name stinkhorn is aptly earned. And you can see here it's covered with flies. So the smell is really gross. Flies are drawn to it, and they actually move the spores from place to place by landing on this sticky, smelly, slimy spore mass. So not something you'd want to eat, but useful and an illustration of how some mushrooms can smell really distinctively. Pheasants' backs, or dryad saddles, they're also called, have this really distinctive, in my opinion, like watermelon rind smell that is just very noteworthy. So that's a key feature. Another thing, some mushrooms will bruise if you kind of touch them. You can see this is a pored mushroom with that pore structure surface. But do you see these dark black staining is where it's been touched. Sometimes those bruises happen immediately. Sometimes it takes a little while for it to happen, but that's something that's useful for identification of many different species. Some mushrooms will kind of bleed this latex-like substance if you crush them or cut them. Also very useful to identify certain groups of mushrooms. And just a note, again, as I mentioned earlier, they can look really different as they mature. So a mushroom might start out looking like this, and then over time, as it develops, just in the course of a few days, it can look really different. Or like this is an Amanita species that I showed some pictures of earlier that's going to start in this kind of little egg-like structure. But if you cut it open, it is not hollow on the inside. It has a little mushroom inside of it. And then it will hatch its way out of that membrane into kind of more what you'd think of as a mushroom. And then these are the gills where the spores will eventually be produced. So another thing that I look for is habitat. Where is that mushroom growing? These two mushrooms are very important to distinguish. This is chanterelles, which we've just established. We love to eat chanterelles. These are some smooth chanterelles that I found in the woods. Great. This is a look-alike that is totally different from the chanterelles, but people will mix it up because it looks kind of similar. They're both orange. They both have these wavy margins. But this one will make you very ill if you eat it. This is a jack-o'-lantern mushroom. You do not want to mix up these two, but they grow really differently. So while they might have some superficial similarities there in terms of the color and the form, they're both going to have decurrent gills or gill-like structures. This one likes to grow in big clusters. You will never see a chanterelle growing in big clusters like this. It's not a thing that it does. This one likes to grow at the base of trees out of the wood, whereas chanterelles are going to be mycorrhizal and they're going to grow more solitary, or maybe a couple of them, but not a big cluster of it. Very useful. And then, of course, some fungi like this one here, they like breaking down dead wood, and you're going to always find it breaking down dead wood. Maybe it's dead wood underground and you can't see that dead wood, but it's always going to be breaking down dead wood. Some mushrooms are even more specific. Not only are they only breaking down dead wood, they're only breaking down one particular species or a few species. So knowing what it's growing on can help you with your identification. So that's kind of just a primer on identification, period, of different mushrooms. And if that's something you're interested in, I encourage you to check out some great resources online. One that I really like is mushroomexpert.com. It's a free resource with a lot of photos and keys to help you in your learning. But of course, you're telling me, well, Ellen, I came to this webinar to learn about mushrooms and I've picked mushroom foraging. I don't want to know how to identify all the mushrooms in the forest. I want to know what I can eat. So then let's shift over to starting with species that are easy to identify. So using all of those tools we just discussed, what are the mushrooms that people forage commonly in the state? And you can easily identify morels would top my list. They are commonly foraged. There's a lot of cultural history about how to eat them. They are present in a lot of different places throughout the state, and you can easily distinguish them from other things. So here's a morel. We have several different species that grow in the state. All of ours are going to be mycorrhizal with the roots of trees. They kind of can have different colors and different shapes. Some might start out this yellowy color and turn a slightly darker color over time, like these black morels here. And if you look kind of broader out from Kentucky, there will be some different types of morels, different species that might grow in different ways, but all of ours are going to be mycorrhizal with the roots of trees. And another key thing to note about morels is that they always are going to be a spring species. You are very unlikely to find, I'm not going to say never, but this is not the time for morels. They are spring, a kind of a limited window of time. And one thing you can do for your area, depending on where you are, to see when would you expect to see morels, there's a website called thegreatmorel.com that does this kind of morel watch each year. When is the first morel found in different areas? And you can see kind of this map of, if you're kind of in our area, it's going to be April, March. But if you go further north, it might be May. If you go further south, it might be, earlier. And then in the Western US, they have different patterns of morels and morel fruiting that, may not line up with what we see here. But this is just a close-up of Kentucky, and you can see this is southeastern Kentucky. The first morels being noted in April and March. And if you're up in northern Kentucky, we're going to look more towards April. So just a fun resource that you can use to figure out timing of that. So morels, chanterelles, two that have already emerged as some of our favorite hunting forage species in the state. As with morels, there are several different species of chanterelles, from these smooth chanterelles, like I showed earlier, with these almost melted looking ridge-like structures, to this cinnabar morel with a darker red color, lutescens here, with slightly different color. This is going to be much more delicate and thinner, Appalachian morels and others. Again, all of them are going to have gill-like structures, but not quite gills on the underside. And that's going to be key for their identification. You also have the lion's manes, the Hericium species. There are a few of those as well. They're always breaking down dead wood. So in this one on a log, here's me sitting with a very big coral Hericium species there. A very nice one. I was delighted to find that and to eat it. So, this has the teeth-like structures instead of the pores or the gills. Chicken of the woods, which has also come up. Now, chicken of the woods, I mentioned that these are commonly foraged species, but just because they're commonly foraged doesn't mean that everyone can safely eat them. Chicken of the woods, a lot of people have allergies to, and it will cause stomach distress, even if it's perfectly safe to eat for other people. And you can find that with different mushrooms. Some people can eat chicken of the woods just fine. Someone else, it might make them feel an upset stomach. Morels, even though they are commonly foraged species, if you don't cook your morels properly, if you don't cook them at all, you will experience GI distress from that. They need to be thoroughly cooked, as do pretty much all mushrooms. So just because they're typically foraged doesn't mean it's necessarily safe for you. In addition, some mushrooms might interact with different drugs or medications that you're taking, and is something that you should always look into. So a few just photos of the chicken of the woods. Chicken of the woods there are a few different species in our area. People will still call them chickens, or you'll hear different names for them, but some of them have a lighter coloration. You can see the pores on the underside here. They might be a lighter color than our typical chicken of the woods, which have that bright yellow color. hen of the woods, which you'll find in the fall at the base of oak trees, oyster mushrooms, which you can find a lot of different times of the year, and many more. This is a wood ear that is commonly used in soups and other things. So there are lots of mushrooms that are commonly foraged, but for all of them, no matter what you're doing, you want to be 100% crystal clear, confident that what you have is what you think you have and not something else. So if you're going to be foraging, learn to distinguish anything from potentially toxic lookalikes. So and sometimes the internet is not your friend with this. So just to give you one example of this, when I was preparing this presentation, I Googled, chanterelle hunting, and I find this photo of some beautiful orange looking mushrooms with this article entitled "Wild Chanterelle Mushrooms Offer Pickers a Delicious Find." Now, I don't know if anybody wants to chime in the chat. Tell me what's wrong with this picture. What have we learned about chanterelles and how do they grow? Will a chanterelle ever grow in a cluster like this? Not that I have ever seen. They don't grow in big clusters like that at the base of trees. That is a common growth form for a different type of mushroom, a toxic jack-o'-lantern mushroom. And this form of these really distinct gills is also a jack-o'-lantern feature. Even the color, to me, while the color can be very similar, there are a lot of things that in my mind say, this is not a chanterelle, this is a jack-o'-lantern. And if you did follow this article and eat this, you would get very sick. You would be very sad about it. So this is a chanterelle, and kind of, if you found the jackpot of all chanterelles, this is as many as you'd see in one. I've never seen this before. This is a picture I found on the internet. But typically they're just growing by themselves on the forest floor, not in a cluster, not at the base of a tree. So if you're out there hunting for chanterelles, you want to have, and you want to have a list in your mind of what about it tells you that it's a chanterelle. It has smooth gill-like ridges that look melted and are difficult to remove from the cap. They're typically solitary or maybe in pairs, but they're coming straight out of the soil, not out of wood and not out of the base of the tree. And if you cut them open, they're going to be white on the inside versus this jack-o'-lantern, which some people will mix up, but can make you quite ill. It's going to have gills that are sharp like these. They go down the stem, but different from what you'd expect for chanterelles. Typically, you'll find them in big clusters. Typically, they're going to be out of woody material, the tree base or some roots. And if you cut them open, it's usually orange on the inside. I'd recommend doing this for any group of mushrooms that you're interested in foraging. A lot of people start with morels and chanterelles for a reason, because you can confidently identify them from anything else. So we got to wrap up soon, so I'm going to rush through this next little bit. Always hunt with knowledgeable folks, and you will be off to a head start. Find a foray, find a local group that's out there hunting mushrooms together and learning from each other. I highly recommend checking out the Bluegrass Mycological Society. It's a community. You can find them on Facebook as well as get their newsletter. And they've got a lot of experts as well as people who are learning together about mushrooms. They offer hikes and field days and different training opportunities. So if that's something you're interested in, check out Bluegrass Mycological Society. They're our kind of local mycological society, and learn more. Take photos that enable ID. So what do I mean by this? You need to show the different parts of the mushroom and show how it was growing where you found it. A lot of times I'll get pictures that look something like this, and I got some guesses, but I really can't do a lot with that. For example, I can't see, this is a video of me being there with it in person. That picture, a picture like that, would show me something else. So you see this structure right here that's intriguing to me. And it tells me, oh, I think I know more about what that is. And then if I dig it up and find out, oh, it's got this sac at the base. It's one of those amanitas that hatched out of that little structure there. And it doesn't have a ring around the stem. All of that I would have missed. And you can, I'm showing a video right now just for our presentation, but photos are excellent because then someone can zoom in on it and look a little closer. Whereas this, we're going to miss all of that. Another just example of this would be if a picture like this doesn't tell me a whole lot about what's going on with it. Makes it really hard for anybody you share this with online. They're going to be like, well, what was under the cap? But if you look under the cap and you find, oh, not only is it gills, but they bleed. Look at that. When I break them and crush them, they bleed. That takes me to a very specific group of mushrooms and really helps with your identification. Photos of the top of the cap are surprisingly unhelpful. There's a lot of stuff underneath. This is the same mushroom from the top. Underneath, you'd have missed all of that. And here's another one where we could get it from the top. But if we missed it from the underneath side, we would miss first this huge swelling at the base, but also this little delicate membrane of fibers that connect the cap to the base that tells me it's a cornarius. So useful information there. For your mushroom identification photos. So again, we just anytime if you do decide to go out and mushroom forage, always remember to store them properly in kind of like a paper bag or something that's not going to hold moisture in there, be airtight. If you're collecting them from the woods, they probably have soil on them, which is going to have bacteria that could contaminate your mushrooms. Make sure you prepare them properly. Pretty much no mushrooms that we would be foraging would be eaten raw. These all need to be cooked, and save a few just in case. There are specialized Facebook groups for mushroom poisoning cases where if you do start feeling ill, you can post photos there, and at least they can narrow it down. You know, are you feeling ill because of that mushroom or is it something else? How do you get that proper medical care? You always want to be going to a medical professional. You don't want to trust your health and well-being to any internet stranger. That's something that's really important, and no mushroom is worth feeling sick about. You don't want to risk it. So speaking of risking it, you also don't want to risk mushroom hunting in a place where you're not allowed to. So if you're interested in learning more about where you can mushroom hunt, you can check out, I've got a publication, Best Practices for Mushroom Foraging in Kentucky, that lists some of our different natural areas and if they allow mushroom foraging or not. One of the key takeaways is that most of the state parks do not allow mushroom foraging there. But most of the federal properties, like the Daniel Boone Land Between the Lakes, do allow mushroom foraging. They still have certain specifications for how much you can take and how to do that properly, but you can check those out. And then again, I want to leave you with the most important thing. Don't eat anything unless you can confidently identify it. You can go to the grocery store and buy mushrooms. You can grow them yourself. Definitely not worth risking your health, your family's health, your friend's health, or even your mental well-being worrying about whether you ate a mushroom that was safe or not. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and open it for any questions that you all might have. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat and I can address those. This is a photo of my daughter when she was much younger. Now she is 7 and she was just a little thing in this photo, and she's touching there an amanita mushroom. Now this is a mushroom that can make you quite ill if you were to eat it, but it is not going to hurt you if you're touching it, and none of our mushrooms here in Kentucky are going to make you sick from touching them. Even the most deadly poisonous mushrooms that we have are only issues if you eat them. And I also put this photo here both to kind of put that reminder out there, but the fun of finding mushrooms and identifying them, that has nothing to do with foraging. Even though this is a mushroom that I would never be collecting to eat, it's a really cool find. What an interesting mushroom to share with my daughter as well as others. A neat thing to encounter and learn about. So I encourage you to mushroom hunt for fun as well as foraging, which I think is what first draws people to mushroom hunting. But there's a lot more to it than that. So we did get a question. Can morels be purposefully grown in backyards with the right preparation? This is a golden time for the cultivation of morels and other mycorrhizal fungi. In the past, I would have said I don't recommend it, and I still don't recommend trying to cultivate mushrooms, especially for any beginner mushroom growers. Morels are, for the most part, all of our native morels are mycorrhizal, so that means they grow with the roots of trees. It is really hard to cultivate those relationships. While it can be done, it typically involves planting. Having sterile seedlings growing, inoculating those roots before they can be colonized by any of the other mycorrhizal fungi that are going to be better suited to that for that particular site. And preventing other mycorrhizal fungi from colonizing and taking over. It is many years, can take many years. So if you want to hunt morels, it's probably best to go to places that have trees that have those relationships to begin with. Now, I say that's what I would have said because there's been some major breakthroughs in morel cultivation, and you can now more confidently than in the past. It's still a gamble, but you can more confidently than in the past try to grow morels. A couple different things that are happening there with morel cultivation. First, there are species of morel, not ones that would grow natively here, but native to the West Coast as well as native to Asia, that will grow on dead plant material. So instead of being mycorrhizal, they would grow on wood chips and other kind of plant material. So you could order that and grow those. And several reputable spawn producers have recently started carrying some of those species. So it makes it easier to grow. If you're growing mushrooms, the mycorrhizal ones are going to be the hardest ones to grow because not only do you have to grow the fungus, but you've got to grow the fungus with its host in the right environment for the two of them to get together and produce mushrooms. So that's one positive thing. But there's also been some research done, especially in kind of high tunnel setups, looking at how to create the conditions that trigger the formation of morels. So the right combinations of soil and nutrients. If you're interested in that, I encourage you to reach out to a reputable spawn producer, and they can probably guide you through that process. Any other questions?
I actually have a question.
Yeah,
Sorry, that
yeah.
was so cool. I'm definitely one of those people where I'm not like confident to, go explore beyond morels. So I'm feeling inspired for sure. That was really cool. Is there
Lion's mane and chanterelle would be my two.
okay,
If you're a beginner,
those
I'd
would be
say
step 2 and
morels,
3.
lion manes, and chanterelles. It's really hard to confuse lion's mane with other things. Chanterelle, you do need to do your due diligence, as with morel, and make sure you have what you think you have. But if you've got your mental checklist of what you're looking for, you will be pretty well prepared to distinguish it from other things.
Is there any book that you would recommend, like people checking
Hmm.
out if they're like, a field guide person,
Yeah.
or is it just such a complex subject that there's not really like
Well, it
one
depends on
book?
what you're trying to do and where you're located. There's a book for the Appalachian area, mushrooms, West Virginia, and the Central Appalachians that I recommend. Um, there are other books that are going to be better for different areas, and none of them are going to cover all of the mushrooms that you could encounter. Now, there are some books that are more focused on foraging, in particular, the species that people commonly forage and how to distinguish them from other things. They're not going to tell you about the whole diversity of what's there. They're really going to focus on some of those in particular. I really recommend mushroomexpert.com. They're a free resource and they've got lots of great stuff. The person who runs it has put out some different books that you can check out that I think are great. And then our online groups are phenomenal and do a really good job with kind of identification. Take anything you see in any of them with a grain of salt, because none of them have to face the consequences of being sick from eating a mushroom. That is something that you have to face and is not worth risking. So I like to bounce every possible resource that's out there before you would risk doing anything. So yeah.
Awesome. Sweet.
I err on the
Thank
side
you.
of caution though.
Yes.
So yeah.
And David is in the chat recommending the amazingly named How to Forage for Mushrooms Without Dying. So we're going to have to add that one to the list to check
Yeah.
out.
I should
Yeah,
warn
I've not
folks,
seen that one.
I've
I'm going to
heard
have
that
to
there's
check
been
it out.
an oh yeah, I've heard there's been an explosion of like AI mushroom
Yeah,
ID books.
I've heard about
So
that in
just a
foraging plants.
caution. Yeah. Um, uh, Bounce anything off of several different resources, especially if it's something new that you're new to thinking about. You want to be completely confident in.
Yeah. Yeah, don't let AI tell you what to forage in the woods.
Oh my
Who
gosh,
who knew that we would need to say this?
well,
Who
and
knew
even
that we would come to this point?
I love iNaturalist. I use iNaturalist all the time. It's really tough for mushroom ID. Not that it can't get you in the right ballpark and help you think about some things. Use it by all means. But because when you do a mushroom ID, you're taking into account all these different features. It's really hard to get all of those in one photo, which is what it's doing. It's kind of like scanning a database of lots of images, but only kind of one aspect of that. In addition to the fact that a lot of mushrooms, maybe not for foraging, like not to tell if you have a chanterelle or a morel, but if you really want to figure out what that species is, it's going to involve some microscope time and it's going to involve potentially some lab work. So there's no way the app is going to be able to get you that. At least we're not there yet. I shouldn't say no way. New things are happening all the time and maybe in the future. But for now, it's a little bit. Okay, there was a question about from the earlier part of the presentation. It's mushrooms on trees. Should or could they be removed to prevent further damage? Or is it too late at that point? So you could remove the fungus, the mushroom, but the bigger problem for your tree is that the inside of your tree, there is a fungus that is growing that is breaking down plant tissue. And removing the mushroom doesn't do anything about that. And also treating your tree with fungicide doesn't really do anything about that because it's probably in tissue that is already inaccessible and is not going to be reached by a fungicide. If you're treating that, like in the heartwood, it's not really going to make it in there. So with trees, it's one of the reasons why it's so important not to wound trees, because any of those wounds are like perfect entry points for decay fungi. We have lots of them in the environment, and if you have wounding, trees are pretty good at keeping those fungi out in their bark, but wounds compromise that and let them in. And by that point, once you have that going, you can't do a lot about that particular fungus. Now you can do a lot to promote the health of the tree overall, extend its life, extend its ability to try to outgrow that fungus. Trees don't really heal. The best they can do is seal off damage and then put on new growth to try to strengthen things. But they're never going to be able to heal a wound like a human would. So preventing those wounds, proper pruning cuts, that's why that's so key for tree health long term. Removing the fungus, I don't think it's really going to help. If anything, it could probably hurt the mushroom. Yeah. Any other questions?
I don't see any. Of course, remember if you are watching this right now or after the fact, you can always reach out to us and let us know if you have any questions. And I'm sure Dr. Crocker would be happy to get those answered for you, or maybe point you in the right direction towards an answer or a resource.
Definitely. Well, it's
Yes,
great
yes,
seeing everyone online. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Anna, for leading this webinar series this summer.
yes. Check out the other ones if you missed them on YouTube, and we'll see you all for the next adventure.
Wonderful. Have a great day, everyone.